Sausage stands are a common sight in Copenhagen. It doesn't take much to set one up. You need a grill, some sausages, and of course, a mobile credit card payment device. These days, only tourists use cash.
In the end, when we have to count the register, there's less money to count, it's a bit easier. There's, again, less room to make error, less things for me and the other guys to have in our head when we're closing down after a long day.
20 years ago, Danes paid for 80% of their purchases in cash. Now it's less than 25%.
Shopping for snacks in Stockholm has got a lot simpler in recent years.
My PIN code, and then it's done.
In part, that's thanks to cashless payment systems, like the one developed by entrepreneur Peter Fredell.
Cash presents a lot of problems for society as a whole. I mean, a lot of people actually want to use cash, but in Sweden, it's definitely lower and lower and lower.
While an estimated 55% of US consumer payments are made with cash, in Sweden, that number is now down to 41%. The idea that banks could cooperate to kill off cash might be unthinkable elsewhere. But it's not so surprising in Sweden, where bills and coins recently constituted less than 3% of the country's domestic product. That's compared to an average across the euro area of almost 10%. Many bank branches here no longer carry hard currency. Homeless magazine vendors, like Jimmy here, use wireless card readers to accept credit and debit card payments.
And then I press this?
Yeah. And certain cell phone stores sport signs saying no cash accepted. In a nation where ever fewer retail transactions are carried out in cash and almost everyone has access to the internet, the new kronas coming out next year may be the last ones the Swedes ever need.
Well, not content with giving the third world toxic vaccines or pumping them full with GMOs, no, now Bill Gates is pushing for a cashless society. Now, he is promoting this digital currency for third world countries as a way to allow the poor to use their phones like credit cards, store their financial assets digitally instead of keeping hard currency at home. He says by 2030, 2 billion people who don't have a bank account today will be storing money and making payments with their phones. Now, he doesn't mention that a cashless society will enslave the poor into an electronic monetary system that they don't control. It's a system that will allow the governments and banks to confiscate money at will through taxes and bail-ins. And this is exactly what we saw happen in Greece. Banking customers there saw 10% of their accounts siphoned to pay off the banksters. Bank accounts were frozen and their accounts were just culled. And as Kit Daniels points out in his article, they wouldn't even need to wait for an economic crisis to loot digital bank accounts. With the cashless scheme that Gates is proposing, they could simply impose a tax and confiscate this money automatically. And confiscating digital currency, it's almost humane compared to what the elite really has planned for the rest of us. Harvard professor Margot Seltzer told attendees at the World Economic Forum in Davos that privacy was dead. And she warns that soon miniature mosquito drones will perpetually monitor individuals and they can forcibly extract DNA on behalf of the government and insurance companies. She said it's not a matter of if they're going to do this, but when.
Like a scene out of movies like The Bourne Identity or any of the James Bond films. Imagine working for the government, faithfully performing your duties for years. Duties that, yes, involved killing people. And after years of inner turmoil from witnessing morally questionable actions, you leave the service, begin sharing your experiences, only to discover that your own government, the one you served, is now trying to harass and intimidate you and your family, shutting off your credit cards, freezing your funds in the bank, going to your mother's house to tell her that she was on an ISIS hit list. That's exactly what's happening to some former Air Force drone operators turned whistleblowers.
I want to quickly go over the different examples of this cashless society that are being implemented throughout the entire world. In fact, we will note that this is not a policy by one individual government. We will see that this is a policy that has been dictated globally by those who control the people in government. Let's look at this first. We're looking at France. France steps up monitoring of cash payments to fight low-cost terrorism. Now, this is just one article out of Reuters, but I want to connect it in with the next article, which is out of Forbes, also about France. They have plans to erect new controls on cash transactions in order to tighten up tax collection and meet the country's optimistic budget deficit target of 3% of GDP. Spain cash transaction ban begins as Rajoy targets tax fraud. Spain began prohibiting consumers from paying cash to settle bills of 2,500 euros or more in legislation designed to curb tax evasion. They use many different excuses for the reason that they want to implement capital controls, but it is all a global policy, as I've said before. So this is not just a European issue. It does, in fact, extend out of the EU, out of Europe, and beyond. But let's look at this first. We're taking this article out of the RT, but it's referring to Denmark. Their central bank, National Bank, plans to stop printing banknotes and minting coins by the end of 2016. It claims that people increasingly prefer the use of credit cards and electronic money in transactions rather than cash. Let's look at Israel. They're eyeing becoming a cashless society. Benjamin Netanyahu's chief of staff has recommended a 3-phase plan to all but do away with cash transactions in Israel. So as I've said, this is a policy that has been going on all around the world. These are global policies dictated not by the governments, but by the supranational organizations and the elite wanting to maintain control over the population. Let's look at Latin America. Here we have Mexican president signs money laundering law banning large cash transactions. Out of Fox News, they signed into law a ban on large cash transactions as part of an effort to fight money laundering that experts estimate may amount to around $10 billion per year in Mexico.
The Financial Times posted an anonymous article today calling for the abolition of cash, which of course gives central banks more power and governments more control. So it's entitled, "The Case for Retiring Another Barbarous Relic." And the article laments the fact that people are stockpiling cash in anticipation of another economic collapse. This is a factor which they say is causing a lot of distortion to the economic system. Now, you'll recall that this agenda to ban cash was one of the things that was being discussed at this year's Bilderberg meeting, which of course was attended by the Financial Times chief economics commentator, Martin Wolf.
The move to the cashless society continues as the Bank of Ireland now is banning small cash withdrawals. Can you believe it? Zero Hedge is reporting in what would be a wake-up call to the world. The Bank of Ireland has banned branch withdrawals of less than 700 euros.
Now, the fingerprints and eye scans of every person in India are being gathered in the biggest biometric database in the world. More than 1.2 billion people's data will be on the system, which will give access to the welfare state. But opponents argue the scheme could be exploited by the Indian government. Alex Rossi reports from Delhi.
This is an enormous task. The fingerprints and eye scans of every Indian in the country are being taken and collated into an online database. When complete, everyone will have a unique 12-digit identity number. It'll enable them to access India's vast and unwieldy welfare state.
Creating the world's largest biometric database is, of course, an enormous challenge in a chaotic country like India with a population of 1.2 billion people. In all, 2.4 billion irises will have to be scanned and 12 billion fingerprints will have to be taken. But critics of the programme argue it's not so much about fighting corruption, but what it will do is give an overbearing state even greater powers to abuse.
Civil liberties groups claim gathering this information is an invasion of privacy. Campaigners like Sanjay Parikh are now urging Indians to boycott the identity project.
Once you collect that information, then all the time that person will be under some kind of a surveillance. And whether that information will be kept in our country secret or it will be passed on to different companies and other countries as well.
Organisers, though, say the database, which includes the biometric details of children and adults alike, will remain confidential. and the benefits to citizens of a more efficient and less corrupt state far outweigh any concerns about intrusion.
So does a cashless economy make for a surveillance state? What's going on here?
Not yet, but I fear that the powers that be are trying to make it so. So the basic gist of the article is that right now cash is the only way that we can actually do transactions that are not monitorable. But various state authorities plus commercial bodies like MasterCard and the banks are trying to push for this cashless society, which basically in a nutshell means that every single transaction you do has to go via a bank.
And we see this, I think, most progressively, if you can use that term, in Sweden, I think, at the moment, is the country that's kind of leading the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sweden and also actually places like Amsterdam. If you go to like, Netherlands and Amsterdam, there's some shops that won't accept cash anymore.
The idea of having your space, every single transaction completely monitored and surveyed by the state is an incredible overreach by the state.
Yeah,
but of course, so that would be one of the arguments against having all money turned into surveyable.
Yeah, so let's just put this in context. I mean, when you go and let's say I go to a coffee shop and I buy my coffee with cash, only me and the coffee shop owner know about it. But if I'm suddenly having to go via a card payment system, there's an intermediary in the process, which means, and they're basically, what's happening is that two banks are actually transacting on our behalf. Now, this obviously opens up the potential for then every transaction to be viewed, but which that could be like the bank itself viewing it, but it could also be passed on to state authorities theoretically. That in turn opens up a second possibility, which is censorship. So if you can view every transaction that people do, you can start to potentially stop them from transacting with certain groups. So for example, actually, if MasterCard or one of these groups decided that I was an unsavory figure, they could turn off Brett's card. He can no longer engage in electronic payment. Now, in a society where your only option is to engage in electronic payment, that could be a very problematic thing.
So to sum it up, your point basically is that these move toward electronic money is dangerous in the sense that it's just amplifying all the worst tendencies of the surveillance state.
Well, let's put it, it's concentrating power in very large financial institutions, yeah, and we should have reason to be concerned about that, and we shouldn't sort of sleepwalk into a financial surveillance state without realizing it. So we should at least try to hold these groups to an account and sort of work on the alternatives.
Well, hopefully there'll be a waking up of the public toward this, and they'll have some kind of epiphany.
The ultimate goal that these people have in mind is the goal to create a one-world government run by the banking industry, run by the bankers, and they're doing it in sections. The European currency, the euro, and the European Constitution is one part of it. Now they're trying to do it in America with the North American Union, right? And they want to create a new currency called the Amero, right? And the whole agenda is to create a one-world government where everybody has an RFID chip implanted in them. All money is to be in those chips, right? There'll be no more cash. And this is giving me straight from Rockefeller himself. This is what they want to accomplish. And all money will be in your chips. And so instead of having cash, anytime you have money in your chip, they can take out whatever they want to take out whenever they want to. If they say you owe us this much money in taxes, they just deduct it out of your chip digitally.
Total control.
Total control. And if you're like me or you, and you're protesting what they're doing, they can just turn off your chip. And you have nothing. You can't buy food. You can't do anything. It's total control of the people.
And that chip's connected to a database that has your purchasing records, what you do, what
everything,
you sell.
Everything is in there, you know? And so they want a one-world government controlled by them, everybody being chipped, all your money in those chips, and they control the chips, and they control people, and you become a slave, you become a serf to these people. That's their goal, that's their intention.